Hello, Mikella. Welcome to Beyond.
Hello, Tiffany. Thanks so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. I'm very excited for our conversation today. And before we get into it, I want to ask you a couple questions about yourself. So first, where in the world are you?
I'm here in Brooklyn, New York.
Okay, and are you from Brooklyn or where are your roots?
My roots are in New Jersey, but I did move around a lot as a young person. So living in New York since 2001, this really feels like my home base.
Absolutely. That is a very long time. Very long time. Yeah, you're settled. And what have you been doing today? What have you been up to?
Oh, it's been an easeful day. I've been catching up with some friends living elsewhere, those Zoom calls that we're continuing in the post-crisis time.
Mm.
Um, I've been engaging in my own meditation and mediumship practice, of course, before we met, and settling in to connect here.
That sounds like a wonderful day. Is it um Is that a normal day for you? What else do you do on your regular days?
I try to spend as much time outside and in connection as I can. So, depending on the time of year, that might be taking a walk in the woods in Prospect Park, or in the summer, I do a lot of ocean swimming to
Mm.
ground myself and connect. I do have a pretty rigorous meditation practice, so that is a part of my everyday routine. And then I engage in some combination of writing, which is a big part of my creative practice, as well as individual session work and facilitating groups.
Wow. I have so many questions. I want to start with your rigorous meditation practice because that sounds fascinating to me. Would you mind sharing with us what that entails?
Absolutely. So I've become a really devoted practitioner of yoga nidra.
Mm.
I really, really love that practice for moving through layers of consciousness. And I also practice meditation in a tantric tradition, which is very inclusive and sort of melds well with my Reiki practice. So it looks a little bit different each day, but it generally involves some combination of conscious breathing and connecting, as well as moving through those layers of conscious awareness and eventually coming into that place of stillness and receiving, right? Getting to that core of who we are.
Yes. Uh, can you explain Yoga Nidra for people who maybe haven't heard of it before?
Absolutely. And apologies, I don't know if I'm the best person to give an official definition,
Okay, we'll
but
tell
as
everybody
I
this is
under
unofficial.
right, don't fact check me. No, my understanding of defining yoga nidra is that it is a deep relaxation and to some extent a sleep adjacent practice. Yoga nidra means yogic sleep. And it's really focused on guiding ourselves through these states of deep relaxation and eventually through the different layers of our energy field or our koshas, and ultimately through our layers of consciousness as one of the ways, like most other forms of meditation, that we find our way towards samadhi, right? Towards bliss, towards that sense of connection and non-dual experience of being one with everything.
Mm, that was a very good non-official definition. And I mean, this wasn't what we planned to talk about. I asked because I started doing yoga nidra this year. I stopped being able to sleep about a year ago, and I got the Open app. I don't know if you've used that one, but they have wonderful meditations, and a lot of the sleep meditations are yoga nidra. And so I had totally associated it with sleep, but when you mentioned layers of consciousness, I hadn't heard it quite described like that. So I really think that's interesting because I have used that time right before I fall asleep and right when I wake up as well, in the morning as one of my favorite places to practice changing state. And I just hadn't really put the two together. So I love how you said that and mentioned it. And I'm curious if it's ever used in the morning for the kind of coming back to consciousness. Do you know?
Absolutely. Yes. And I want to call out that most of my, studying or work or practice with Yoga Nidra was with my teacher, Tracy Stanley. And I think her description of it, at least in my previous exposures to this type of meditation, was a bit unique in the emphasis on that
Hmm.
because, it can be used for sleep, but ideally, you're not falling asleep during Yoga Nidra, right? You're remaining aware even as the body moves into a sleep-like state,
Yeah.
which allows us to really get the full benefits. And what it also means is that those transitional places, right, those spaces between become these portals into that deepest part of ourselves so that over time we can really practice throughout the day so that that time when you're transitioning from waking to sleeping and from sleeping to waking are really powerful portals for that,
Mhm.
as well as really any kind of transition. So
Mhm.
for me, this became a really, really supportive and complementary practice to the way that I was using energy practice and mediumship because it made space for that. But it also allowed me to develop a relationship with that kind of shifting back and forth that
Mhm.
was really focused on finding my own center.
I love
So it's
that.
really nourishing
Absolutely.
in a way that, let's be honest, mediumship I wouldn't always use the word nourishing. It can be, but it also can be a bit tiring.
Mhm.
It can be overwhelming, right? So this kind of means that I have some space every day in the void that's really just a restorative healing place for me.
I love that. It's interesting because as I started doing more meditations at night, to try to fall asleep, I started noticing during the day when I was rushing between things that I needed those moments of meditation in between. And I would actually started taking a like 2 to 5 minute break when I changed tasks in a day and would do a similar sort of, I don't know, meditation or breath work or something like that because all of a sudden it felt, I don't, I don't even have a good word for it, almost like gross to just like rush from one thing to the next without stopping and finding a transition.
Mm.
So I loved hearing you talk about that as well of the during the day. I mean, throughout, even when we're doing the most mundane things, it can be really helpful.
Yes. Isn't it like amazing how just being in that space, right? Be moving through these spaces of awareness result in these predictable common experiences across different people, right? Where you are sort of pulled towards that. So that makes me really excited to hear because it also validates some of my experiences as well, right? Where you're naturally pulled towards something and then you learn, oh yeah, that's actually a part of it. And it's like, wow, I learned that through practice.
Yes. Yeah.
So
And I was like,
cool.
oh, I didn't just make this up.
Yeah.
Although we kind of did. It's a rediscovery.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a little bit about your mediumship practice. And I love what you said that it isn't always nourishing. I was just talking about this with a friend yesterday of like mediumship's so intense sometimes. Like, how do we find ways for it to be not so intense all the time? Like it doesn't have to be a situation where somebody's crying every time, right? And like it can be joyful and fun and nourishing. And one of those ways I engage with that is by engaging with a mediumship practice that isn't about like a reading, right? It isn't always somebody else giving me a reading, for free in a circle, if for money, whatever it is, but it's just a practice and a part of life. And I know that's something that's important to you. Maybe you can tell us a little about it.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like in order to describe what my practice is now, I should probably say a little bit about how it began,
Please.
because much of my practice now is a direct response to how it began. So I had what I understand to be a fairly common experience, which was that I did, in hindsight, always have this strong connection from a very young age. But it became, I don't want to say dormant, but it just wasn't something I paid attention to for a long, long time. And I had really turned the volume down on it. And then I had an accident that resulted in a fairly traumatic injury and a long-term nerve complication. And in the course of figuring out how to redefine that relationship with my body, being in sort of that altered state of like healing, of physical healing, it sort of turned on full volume very quickly and unexpectedly in a way that was really overwhelming for me. It really did seem like it happened almost overnight. And it accelerated as I started exploring Reiki, which was something I was drawn to as part of my injury recovery. And there was a period of time where it was very unwelcome to me. It was frightening. It felt intrusive, like I didn't have any control over it. Like, um, people were coming into my bedroom and staying there overnight in a way that wasn't invited. And it was scary both in the sense of just not feeling in control and that being upsetting. But look, a lot of times the spirits that are really knocking on our door, they're in some distress. Um, and so they're not like coming in a really even keeled, relaxed sort of vibration. Um, and I struggled for a while with that, and really just trying to set boundaries around that and not being sure how to use it. I was really fortunate that I did eventually connect with a teacher that really resonated for me, Asia Deshur, and she really helped me to learn how to set boundaries so that I could work with mediumship in a way that felt manageable for me. And for a while, it continued like that. I felt this strong pull towards it. Like this was important. This was something that it was like a gift. It was something that I needed to work with. But I took a couple classes on evidential mediumship, and it just didn't really resonate for me. It was like, well, I have work I do with people already. I'm not going to quit my job and just do mediumship sessions. And personally, for me, it actually just, the style of it just didn't resonate for me as much. It felt almost as if the spirits that I was making contact were more my clients rather than the living person that was coming in. And so, cutting to the chase, what it looks like for me now is that I make space in my meditation, in my time outside, in my experience day to day to really be open to spirit presence in my life. I have clear boundaries around it, but I do make the time to make that connection, which sometimes includes that energetic support for those on the other side. I think a lot of people who go through several levels of Reiki training find this, that you start having that experience of folks who need a little bit of energetic assistance with their transition. So that is a part of it. But what really changed things for me is I started talking to spirits who were actually there to help me,
Mm.
which is to say, I got comfortable, having ghost friends in my life who weren't in distress, who weren't in crisis. And I got comfortable with that communication, and the boundaries started to feel really intuitive and easy. And that fear piece started to fall away, where it felt just the same way that, if I go out if I go out to lunch with a friend of mine, at some point our lunch ends. And I'm not like, oh, I'm so sorry, our lunch is ending. I'm so sorry I'm leaving you. I'm not like, oh, maybe we should stay here another 3 hours, right? It's like, no, we both have to go. And I walk home and I close the door behind me and I lock the door to my apartment. And I'm not like, oh, is she offended that she's not here with me, right? Like there's an ease to those boundaries with spirit so that it feels like a relationship that's healthy on both sides.
Ah, I love this. There's so much to dig into here. I'm just gonna keep going with boundaries for a little bit, and then I want to go back to the beginning and the turning on and off. But this boundaries thing is so important. And as I started working on the book that I've been working on this past year, um, I started getting really literal with some of my boundaries, like especially the ones I had in the beginning. And I started writing them. And what I noticed was exactly what you just talked about is that I was like, oh, this can be just like talking with humans who are alive. Like the same, I don't know why we often, or at least I came into this being like, oh, it's so different. And yeah, I would do all these weird things like you alluded to, like feeling bad for like closing the connection or, all these things that we would never do with a living human. And I also started thinking about it the way I think about with animals or with nature or a place. Like connections open and close and they start and they end, both over time and over space. And, one of the biggest things I recommend is when somebody isn't sure about how to go about a connection, what would you do if that was a living person? And think about that and just start there at least. And I'm curious of if you have any examples or boundaries that you started with and or you've kept over time, um, or examples of how you use them that helped you get to where you are, because I don't think it's often shared or talked about that this is how we develop these connections.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's great advice, first of all, and advice I live by as well, right? Is like try inserting that like an example of a living relationship and let that kind of guide you to like how would you handle that, right? Like what kind of conversation would you have? But we're also talking about energetic boundaries too, right? Not just what we're saying. So there's a few different practices that have become a regular routine for me that I use. The first is, and I imagine I'm probably not alone in this, but I have a very rich dream life. I'm a bit of an insomniac, so I don't sleep super deeply, and I am a lucid dreamer. And that seems to be the time where I'm really close to the other side and everybody wants to talk. So at, I mean, at this point for several years, every night before I go to sleep, I establish an intention for energetic protection that is going to be maintained while I'm unconscious. And I really state clearly if I'm open to connecting or not,
Yes.
which is to say that it's actually more like occasionally, I have open office hours.
Yes.
I let folks know I'm available tonight for one or two people. Um, and otherwise, I make it clear that I'm not. And although sometimes it seems almost too simple to work, I find that it works beautifully. And on the occasions where I felt a bit intruded upon, it's almost always because I was really tired and I fell asleep and I didn't start with that, right? I left it just a little bit loose. So I establish those boundaries every night before I go to bed. And especially when I'm doing any kind of therapeutic energy work, healing work with other people, I'm also very clear about my willingness of like who I might be open to engaging with. And I think for this is fine really as an ongoing process, but certainly for folks at the beginning, I think being really clear that you're only working with folks who are pretty well in spirit,
Yes.
who are in a vibrant place. I think that's a very reasonable boundary. I mean, we have that in most of our life, right? Like
Right.
we've we can't always stop encounters from happening with folks who are unwell, but we're not going to invite that into our life necessarily unless it's like our job or we have some sort of reason for it. And so that's how I approach my relationship with the spirit world as well. Um, and I also I also found that it was really helpful for me to practice my capacity to connect and to receive and offer information um, in practice and in relationship with plants and trees
Hmm.
as a way of building those boundaries in a place that I felt really safe. Right? That if I sort of took things in a little too deeply, I'm not really, well, maybe not everyone feels this way, but I'm not really concerned about like some sort of sinister force in connecting with the tree. I feel very like there's no real scary consequence to not being clear on that. So, especially when I practiced using techniques like blending, I practiced with trees because I felt safe and I learned how to navigate that on that nonverbal energetic level.
I love that. I hadn't quite thought about why I feel so safe with natural connection or connection in the natural world. And it's definitely feels like a safe place for me to experiment as well. Do you want to describe for people blending, just for those who might not be familiar?
Absolutely. So, in a mediumship practice, to my understanding of it, we come to a certain point where we're aware of a presence. And how we become aware of that is a little different for everyone. It sort of depends on your unique sort of psychic language, but we come aware of the presence and we've expanded our energy as a sort of beacon or something for them to connect to and find. And blending is when we're inviting a mingling of their energy field and ours, right? Where there's a bit of blending at the edges. And that's where we really start to receive the experience of the person. And to my understanding, that's where a reading really begins, where the information starts flowing more organically. And for me, that's all, yes, in the way that I practice, that's also where that channel is really fully open. And I was taught basically like that. That was pretty much the whole explanation I was given for blending. And
No,
I'll be honest with
yeah,
you,
that's it.
I was like, what if I don't want them to blend with my energy field? I don't know them. I don't even like to hug people I don't know, like when I invited like a spirit, like into my energy field. So it took a little, I think that there is a bit of gray area there where some people feel really comfortable with that right off the bat. And a lot of people like me are like, I want to kind of figure out how I feel about that for myself.
Absolutely. I recommend people start with like a contact point outside of their body, like just to that point of start, meet someone or meet the connection outside of the body, and then practice figuring out how you want to actually receive communication from them once you've met in a safe distance, just like with a person. You don't usually meet a person inside your house, right? Like, you take some steps before you get to that. Um, I love that example or how you describe blending though. And I wanted to ask so many people, just getting back to the mediumship for as a profession, when we're learning this, usually the purpose of blending and receiving that communication is so that you can say it out loud to somebody sitting in front of you, right?
Mhm.
And this is where, when I was learning mediumship, I felt like I had to get really creative about what am I doing this for if I'm not having a sitter in front of me. And I do some readings for people and I definitely sit in circle, but the majority of my practice is also like a is something else. And I'm curious some of the ways that you use that blending and that connection that aren't what we all imagine, what's on the TV shows, the typical mediumship reading. Because for me, there wasn't other ideas. And I felt like I had to make it up of what am I going to do with this? But yeah, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Absolutely. Well, I felt the same way. I felt like I had to figure it out on my own, and I had to make up my own practices that worked for me. So the first thing that for me feels really different is that oftentimes when we're working with someone else, and I do find this a little bit different, like sometimes it does come up like in my energetic work with clients, right? Or even in hypnosis, very occasionally in therapy even. It does come up sometimes, but usually that's more organic and requires less of the let me give you a string of information to help you identify who it is, right? But one of the amazing things about a personal practice is that there is no checklist there for you to try to prove. You're not really proving it to anyone, right? There isn't exactly a need to offer evidence to yourself in the same way, which means that for me, I would consider myself pretty psychic. I mean, I'm I am skilled and gifted in that in a variety of different across the clairs, but sometimes I'm connecting with a being where we're not exactly speaking the same language. I'm not entirely sure that I'm getting such a clear sense of the details that would be provable in some way. But because it's just me in that relationship, I'm able to focus more on actually, I mean, think about it like in a conversation with somebody else, right? Have you ever had that conversation where someone doesn't understand exactly what you're saying and they like interrupt your point to ask you a bunch of clarifying questions and you're like, this isn't important. You're focusing on the wrong details, you know? And I think in a personal mediumship practice, we're able to listen more deeply, right? So maybe I'm not understanding exactly where this person is from, right? Or the image is really foggy and I'm not getting those details. I can ask, is that important? If it's not important, then I can set it to the side. Say, well, why are you here? What is important? You tell me. So that piece of it to me feels really freeing, right? Because we're really focusing actually on we're focusing on them in the relationship in a way. Like, why are you here and what is it that you want to share rather than us being in like kind of a Q&A
Mhm.
engagement where we're finding the things that are relevant to us. So that's probably the first, maybe that's the most major difference, right? Between a personal practice and a sitter. You don't need to be concerned about that part at all. But I think it also opens the door to that kind of communication that's much more of a knowing and a feeling, right? That may be really difficult to put in words. If you had to explain it to someone in front of you, it might actually slow you down or almost muddy the waters
Mhm.
to try to put it into words or to try to describe an image that's like nothing you've ever seen before. And when you're in that personal practice, instead, you can put all of your effort and energy to just continuing to go on this ride with them, continuing to go where they're taking you, where they're showing you.
I love that. And you're reminding me of what you said in the beginning that it feels like for you, a lot of times your your contact, the spirit that you're working with is your sitter, sort of, or that's who you're working with. And that's I mean, that's so important and not that common, I would say. I know we're even in kind of client mediumship, there are kind of two schools of thought. I don't know if they would separate themselves this much of that you focus on the sitter or you focus on the spirit. And, who are you exactly serving, or are you serving both? And the idea that maybe we're just here and we do some of this work to connect with and enjoy and spend time with those who are on the other side without this constant need for evidence or proof or even an outcome. It's just, would you say it's kind of like hanging out? Like you know, it's just being together?
Yeah, it can absolutely be like that. It can be like hanging out. I had I wrote about this a bit recent in a recent essay, that one particular sort of spirit friend of mine who was, I mean, I'll be honest, was not welcome at the time that it happened. Like I was just freaked out. Who are you? Like, why are you here? I wasn't like particularly open about it at the time, but became really something, yeah, like a friend, like a trusted friend who saw things a little bit differently than me, right? Who sometimes had interesting perspectives on events that were transpiring, who helped me to become more comfortable and have a more like joyous and fun relationship with mediumship, where it wasn't all this like heaviness and ancestral healing, intergenerational trauma and traumatic deaths, right? And it was all like there was so much heaviness involved in it. And in that relationship, there was levity, there was humor. It was the first time that I really pushed the edge of blending, where it was like, well, like, okay, do you want to join me here? And having that experience of, I mean, in a way, I feel like I got to have this taste of what it's like to be unembodied,
Mhm.
right? Of what it's like to be sort of like amorphous, right? What that feels like. And it was really fun.
I love it. It can be fun.
It can be fun. It can be fun. And I mean, talk about the boundaries, right?
Yeah,
I,
that's
when
exactly
I
what I
was
was gonna say. I was like, with lots of boundaries, it can be fun.
with lots of boundaries, and, as I got ready to publish that essay, right, to post that essay, I asked, like, it was almost like giving it to a friend that's mentioned in there, right? Like, are you comfortable with everything that was said? Does this feel accurate to you? Is there anything you'd want me to add? Um, and it was, a cool experience to share that openly. And then he kind of let me know, like, all right, well, I'm gonna go now.
Oh, wow. So it's over?
I mean, it's yeah.
I love that.
I
I
mean,
mean,
not over like for like the same way that when people die, is it over? I mean, like,
yes.
yes and no. Like, yes, it is over, but it's, you always remember it. It's not like a punishment,
Yeah.
right? But it was like, oh, right, like this is why you came here. Like you did the thing you wanted to do, and you're like, well, I'm gonna go do something, something else,
Right.
instead of hanging around your house all the time.
I love that. So that is a great reminder of your Substack. And if someone wanted to read that essay, it's on your Substack. That's right.
It is, yes. It's in the essay called Rib Cage.
Okay. And that's between spaces on Substack?
It's spaces
Oh,
between.
spaces between.
It's
Yes.
spaces between, and
That's
the
much more poetic than what I misremembered.
both are good. Both work equally. But the intention of those essays is to really invite you into something like a daydream,
Mm.
where as the reader, you can get a little feel for how there is this connecting thread between trances, between dreams, between different visions and encounters, that they often seem really disconnected, right? But when you start to pull on that thread, you realize that, it is, as my teacher would say, a 24-hour practice, right? It's like happening all the time. In your walk in the woods, in your time swimming in the ocean, when you're talking with a spirit friend, when you're working with someone else, when you have a really strange dream,
Yes,
when you're wondering about some esoteric concept, right? That there is like kind of this current or flow of information that connects them all together.
absolutely. I love that. I think that's such an important reminder and kind of a theme for maybe both of us about that this practice doesn't have to be this little thing over here in a little box that is, you know, very special and very different. It's just kind of another way of regular life.
I mean, I would agree, but I'll be the first to say that it's taken me a really long time to like kind of come out of the closet as like,
Me too.
this is something that I do. And I mean, we all have the obvious fears, right? People are going to think that you're crazy, right? Or people are going to almost like lose respect for you, right? Or think that it's made up. But what surprises me the most is how many people are like, that's really cool. I think I encountered a spirit once.
Right.
Right. And then they tell you a story about it, or like, do you think we can talk to aliens too? Right. Or like other unexpected conversations, because I do think that we all have that ability, all of us.
Me too. And it's a good point. Like there are edges to it in our culture, and it's also misused a lot, and it's also made scary a lot. And as normal as it can be and as everyday as it can be, like you mentioned, it takes a long time to develop that capacity and that comfort. It might not have made taken a lot of time for people in a different time in a different culture, but if you're raised the way I was raised, it takes even with spiritualism in my family, still like there's a lot of undoing to be safe and to find comfort in the practice. And I loved hearing about your a little bit of your journey with that.
Mm.
So I really enjoyed talking with you, and I want to make sure everybody knows we'll put some of these links in the show notes. Maybe we can include your teachers who you mentioned too, because they sound very, very interesting. Um, and thank you so much for sharing. It was wonderful to talk about all this with you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the show. I was really delighted to talk with someone of a like mind and heart.
Right? We don't get to talk about all this that much, so it really is fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
All right. Thanks, Mikella.